All right, so you're ready to make the move. You're like, I'm all in on the cloud. I'm going to move some of my workload to the cloud or move all of it. But what questions should you ask your cloud provider or the vendors you're working with? Well, let's talk about the 7 questions you should ask each vendor just to make sure that you're making the right decision. All right, I've had a lot of discussions with business owners and executives, and it's a common question to come up with is like, well, what should I ask the cloud providers? So what I did is I put together 7 questions that you should ask each vendor, each cloud provider before you make a decision. And what I want to do in this video is go through each of these 7 and give you a little more context to each one. So let's get started. Number 1 question I would ask a cloud provider is, what is your service level agreement or SLA? And specifically, this is talking about the uptime of the product that you're buying, whether it's IaaS, where you're moving your infrastructure there, or just an application, like maybe it's QuickBooks. But what is the uptime? Because 99% sounds awesome, right? 99% uptime is awesome. It's like, oh, cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Until you realize it's 3 days and 15 hours of downtime during a year. Not so awesome. But then some providers will say, well, we're 99.9. And you're like, that's great. That's still almost 9 hours of downtime annually. And then you're like, okay, all right, let's move to 4 nines. Let's move to 99.99. Well, that's 52 minutes, a little over 52 minutes. And then if you finally get to 5 nines, which is like the pinnacle of availability, I mean, some people say 100%, but that's not realistic. 99.999%, so 5 nines. It's only 5 minutes of downtime during a year. So just by adding a 9, you can see how much that changes. You can go from 3 days to 5 minutes. That's a big deal. And that's something that's the first thing you should talk about with the vendor, because you want to understand like how much anticipated downtime are you going to have during a year. And then you can also ask, well, how have you historically been? So show me the last couple of years to see where you fall upon your SLA. And typically what will happen with SLA is they'll give you a financial payment or refund or credit when they don't meet it. But what does that really mean? Because a lot of times it could mean nothing. It could mean you were down for a day, so here's 3 cents. So that's one of the first questions I would ask. So let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is what is the true cost? What is the cost of ownership of this cloud? Because a lot of times what you're told by the vendor isn't necessarily true. You'll get into it and you'll be like, oh, like maybe it's supposed to cost X, but then all of a sudden you look in there and now it's X, Y, Z, A, B, C, like they keep adding things on and the cost gets out of control, but you've already moved, so now you just deal with it. You want to understand the cost before you get into it. And I'll give you a good example. Knowing how to optimize the cost of moving like servers to the cloud is critically important. It could mean the difference of a savings of 66 to 75% over monthly costs just by knowing how to maybe leverage licenses with a certain provider to make sure that you're getting the best benefit. So when you're buying an application, maybe there's not a lot of shopping there. Like QuickBooks may offer you something like 3 months for half price, but then you know what the cost is. Maybe you go to a QuickBooks advisor, maybe you can get a cheaper rate, maybe not, maybe you find a coupon. Okay, fine. But when you start moving servers, you start moving infrastructure, it's a completely different ballgame. There are tons of cost optimizations that you can do that a good provider can give you that can cut your costs down. It could be anything from, like I said, buying licenses to make sure it offsets some costs to, hey, maybe we shut these servers off at night because they're not needed. And now we just cut down 12 hours of daily operations. So instead of paying for 30 days a month, maybe we're paying for 15 days a month. So those are the things you want to keep in mind and pay attention to is what's the true cost? Now, there's going to be some variability with cost structure in the cloud, so keep that in mind. But for the most part, you should get pretty close to like what the total cost should be. And if there is some variance, what you can do is you can say, okay, let's look at it for 30 days and see if we can get like what an estimate's going to be. So a lot of times you can run like a POC or proof of concept to make sure that can happen. But pay attention. You want to make sure you know all the costs before you sign that paper. So here's a big one for me. Number 3, Do you offer migration support of my data in and out of your service? That's a big one. Because what you'll find is sometimes they will help you migrate your data in, but when you go to leave, let's say they want to lock you in, do vendor lock-in, they make it very difficult to leave. And that's something you want to know up front. You don't want to go into a relationship thinking, oh, you know what, this is going to fail and I need to get my data out, but you absolutely should think like that. You really need to understand, how do I get my data out if it doesn't work out? If I want to go back to a different product or I want to switch to a different product. Understanding that's critically important. We just dealt with a customer. They're looking at a certain application that they run, and they can get it hosted in the cloud. They can get a software as a service hosting for it. And the problem is the contract they sent over, I had a lot of questions for them, and it pertained really to vendor lock-in, because they weren't really specific about if they would help us get the data out and how they would deliver that back. And you want to know that. You want to make sure that you understand that, because what you don't want is all your data to be shoved on a hard drive and shipped to you and then say, oh, well, we did what we said in our contract. So make sure you read the contract to understand that. All right, so number 4 is really easy. It's like, how do you back up my data? How do you handle that? Because that's pretty important. If you make a mistake and you delete some data that's important, can you recover it? Or do you have to bring a third party in to make sure that you're backing it up, so if you make a mistake, you can recover it? And that's really important. So you need to understand that. You need to ask how everything's going to be backed up. How often are backups being taken? How quickly can they be restored? Is there transactional level backups? So like I said, QuickBooks is a good example, because if you make a transaction mistake, can you back out of it? Can you undo it? Can you restore from it? And you really want to understand that before you go into it, so you understand, like, hey, I need to plan for this. So if somebody screws up and they delete like a customer, how easy is it to get that customer back? Or do we have to go back to the previous day, which is a big problem if it's 4 o'clock on a Tuesday and you need to go back to Monday at 5 o'clock. So you want to understand how they're backing your data up and understand how quickly they can restore it, just to make sure if something does happen that you could get back up and running. All right, number 5 is a little different. It's like, how do you handle disaster recovery and business continuity? Now, this is different from backup. They have some sort of incident. So Kronos is a good example. They provided time in HR for a lot of companies, and their cloud had an outage that lasted weeks at the end of last year into the beginning of 2022. And it affected hospitals, universities, big companies, where they didn't have HR over like the Christmas season and into the new year. Their disaster recovery and business continuity was terrible. And I guess the companies didn't understand that. So this is something you critically want to understand. If they have a ransomware incident or they have a cyber incident, it could be denial of service attack, what's their business continuity plan for that? And then if it is ransomware, what's their disaster recovery look like? Are they going to be back up and running in a day? Are they going to be back up and running in 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 4 weeks, 3 months? These are big time issues you need to understand and ask before you get locked into a vendor that, hey, look, they don't have a good plan. And if something bad happens, I don't know how long we're going to be back up, and that's going to affect your business. So you want to make sure you understand and ask, how is disaster recovery and business continuity handled? So number 6 is, how do you handle compliance, and do you have a certification for your data center? So I'll start with certifications really quickly. SOC 2 is a gold standard. And what SOC 2 does is it looks at the system and the organizational controls for security, and it's the third-party audit, so make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing to handle that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's super secure. It just means that they're following through. They have plans and controls, and they follow through on those. Now, compliance is a different story. Are you bound by PCI DSS? Are you bound by HIPAA, GDPR? Do you have some sort of government compliancy that you have to meet? You want to make sure that wherever you put your data matches the compliance that you're bound by for your business. So you need to ask those questions to your vendor to make sure that they're actually handling it properly and you don't get hit with some sort of fine or issue if something happens to the data. So number 7 is, how do you handle cybersecurity? How do you handle cybersecurity issues? Again, this is critically important. And I know I lead with security a lot, but understanding how they protect your data, how they actually have cybersecurity measures, defense in depth, things like that in place is really important. Again, I go back to Kronos, or I go back to some of the other hacks that we've seen where they had glitches in their cybersecurity that led to the cyber incident happening. And it's important to understand and ask the questions, how do they handle it? And they should be able to give you like some sort of, it might be boilerplate for them, but they should be able to give you some sort of report, or maybe they follow a security framework that they could give back to you. Maybe their ISO, maybe their NIST, maybe their CIS, stuff like that, where they give you a framework and they say, look, we follow through on all this. It's not bulletproof. Nobody's bulletproof from having a cyber incident. But you want to make sure that they're doing something, making sure that they have separation of duty in their business, make sure that they have networks that are separated so that maybe one customer can't get to your information. So if they get hit, you don't get hit. Things like that. You want to make sure that's in place, and you want to make sure that they provide you with proof of that. All right, I know I flew through those 7 questions, and I tried to give you some context behind it. We can have a deeper conversation about this. If you have any questions, reach out to us, DM us, comment down below, like, subscribe, share, and we'd love to have a conversation, even if it's through social media. Just how are you buying cloud, and have you asked some of these questions before? Comment down below, let us know. So until next time, stay cyber safe.